I'm April Long, the beauty director at Town & Country, and I'm here to introduce Cartier Perfumer Mathilde Laurent and New York floral designer extraordinaire Louis Miller. Mathilde is a wildly creative avant-garde perfumer who brings her passion for fine art, the natural world, and even cuisine to her unique and beautiful work. Louis is the creator of the famous Flower Flash, guerrilla-style street art installations made with flowers. He's been called the Banksy of floral design by The New Yorker, and his clients include Tiffany & Co., Ferragamo, Harry Winston, and the New York Public Library. Welcome to you both. So, as you know, for Fragrance Day 2021, we're celebrating florals. So I would love for you both to tell us a bit about your approach to flowers. What makes your creations unique among other perfumers and floral artists? Mathilde?
Okay, thank you. I would say my work with flowers is maybe different because what is moving me, what I'm always running after is life. And I have always been trying to create perfumes that smell life, perhaps more than even flowers. I want to have people smelling the life of and living flowers, because in perfumery we use oils or absolutes from flowers, but very often flowers have to be cooked to get these oils and absolutes. And at the end, we have floral perfumes, but they seem to be like dry flowers, not really fresh and living flowers. And this is what I have been always running after, this smell of life in nature. How does a flower smell when it is on the tree, when it is in the garden, and trying to give this feeling of life in the bottle? And I think it's really the definition of my quest in perfumery, and what I try to create as a feeling in all the Cartier perfumes I've been creating.
I think for me as a floral designer, my work it started and has always really been heavily inspired and entrenched in sort of the Flemish paintings, the very classic still life. I've always loved, it's always been a very abundant. So there's been fruit, there's been flowers, there's been vines, there's always been a lot of movements. It had to feel very, very natural. Then when I moved to New York in 2000, that even more felt so, in a way it felt out of place, which to me felt all the more necessary, being in such an urban environment, to have that, again, that just sort of like unapologetic nature and kind of wildness, which obviously then turned into the Flower Flash, into the street art. I think for us urban dwellers, nature and space are two of the biggest luxuries, and having, that kind of life force and that sort of raw energy. And it's also like, it's not precious. It's not like very delicately, it has to have this sort of guttural nature to it. There is sort of a manneristic approach to it. It's like the arrangements are almost maybe sometimes too big for their vessels, or is that sort of like a manneristic painting? It's like the proportions are slightly off, but it is kind of almost falls under the weight of its own sort of abundance and volume. But at the same time, like, I'm so attracted to very old-fashioned flowers, like, roses, obviously, and anemones and peonies, and flowers that have a lifespan, that have the full span from tight bud to a beautiful decay, to seed pods and fruit. And so that kind of mixed with the urban environment, it kind of really pushes it into a more modern, application, I guess, and satisfies my need for duality. I love duality, whether it's light and dark, whether it's raw and refined, whether it's rough and smooth, whether it's, joyful but dark and mysterious. So there's always that little bit of tension that I think. And then ultimately, with all that aside, flowers are about joy. Like, there's really one purpose. I don't want to get so heady and so involved into the art and the artistry of flowers that we stop seeing their main purpose, which is just to lift the spirits. And I think when you can combine all those things together and just create something that has a sense of joy to it, that has some surprise, but still pays homage and still takes us back to the kind of the fine arts of European application in painting and molding and textiles. That's kind of a long way of saying how it all funnels to some sort of vision, I guess.
They're beautiful. I was the lucky recipient of the special Valentine's Day flower flash that you created, Louis, to celebrate the launch of the Cartier Wild Roses collection created by Mathilde, which was an incredible collaboration. Can you each talk about what the rose evokes to you and how you like to work with it?
Mathilde, you first.
Really, the rose in perfumery is a very special rose. I would say it's a kind of queen of perfumery. Everybody knows is the rose in perfumery. It is an historical inspiration. It is mythical. And every perfumer has to demonstrate and to create, in one sense, his rose or her rose, I would say. But it is also, I would say, the worst flower also in perfumery, because it can be the cheapest, it can be the ugliest, it can be the simplest in the bad way, I would say, in the bad sense. So for me, the rose is totally has two faces. And this is why I didn't want to work. It is really the first time I work on a rose, because I hated these two faces, and I didn't want to take this path that is a very common path. The rose is the most common path in perfumery, and yet it is maybe the most expensive absolute and oil you can find in perfumery. So I didn't want to work on it. I hated it. This is why this collection, the real name of the collection is I Hate Roses. But at the end, in this collection of Les Épures, I started to create a kind of photography of perfumes in nature, with the lily of the valley, the magnolia, and the pure quinquan. And in that collection, I decided to work on a rose, saying myself, it will be a real rose, not a perfumer's rose. It will be your challenge will be to offer nature, not perfumery. So you will have to forget everything of yourself, of being a perfumer, to recreate really the life in the flower when it is in a garden, without adding nothing. And in the idea of leur oser, I wanted to make the rose coming back to earth and having being I don't know what would be the word, but head over heels, in fact, and to put it in earth, so that this rose start to smell like earth, and like everything and anything that has never been mixed with a rose. I wanted to create a naked rose, a really simple rose of garden without being a perfumer, and at the other extreme, I would say, a punk rose, to really offer two things that didn't exist in perfumery with rose. So it's really because of these two symbols of the queen of perfumery and the monster of perfumery that I decided to go out of perfumery at the end, to try to escape perfumery.
It's so interesting because I feel like in my industry, the rose is sort of the same way. Like it can be the most, it can be the pinnacle of it can be the queen of the flowers, or it can be the prostitute of the flowers. It can really be.
I didn't find the word. Thank you, Lewis, because I didn't know how to say it in English. Thank you.
I grew up in Central California where everything grew. It was a very Mediterranean climate. It was, and roses, we had roses. And so flowers were always a part of my life, but the roses really grew incredibly. And in the summer, they would go from April through October, we would just have magnificent roses, and they smelled good. Those were roses from the garden, and they would be the hybrid teas, and they would be the floribundas, and they would be the climbing roses. And then later on in my life, in my teenage years, is when the David Austin hybrids, which started to be produced for the North American and certainly for the English, but then the North American market. And then those were the old-fashioned roses. I had never seen those roses. Those were the full roses with the high petal count that the ones you'd only seen in paintings, and that took away that, like, you had the classic Americana rose, and then you had this beautiful, and then my love affair with roses kind of started all over again. And being a summer baby and a June baby, and rose was my my flower. It's my month flower. What do you call it? My birth flower. And then having them in California, I always loved roses. But they kind of wane in and out of fashion in the floral world. And I kind of think that working with roses is, when I was taking interior design courses for a while, the way we would study interior design throughout the history from Egypt till present is we had to draw chairs. We had to sketch chairs, from the Klismos chair to the Louis XIV, so you could tell the style, and that you could tell the fashions and the patterns, and it would always go a classic period, then it would go romantic, and then it would go back to classic and romantic, and you could trace the whole thing of interior design with chairs. And I feel like that's what the rose is for floral design. It is, you can really trace where the modern trends are and the current aesthetic is in the application of the rose. In the 90s and 2000s, we did tight domes of roses. Now, on the opposite end of the scale, it's this much more lavish thing. The hybrids are getting, more prolific, more different varieties. People are more interested in the authentic roses, the roses that we can get from the garden as versus the hothouse. Sometimes roses are the feature, and sometimes they end up playing second fiddle. They're the bass note, where the more fashionable flower, like a ranunculus or an anemone, becomes the main flower, and the rose actually ends up being the filler flower. So, the rose, I always love the rose. And it's always very much a part of my work, because this goes back to just, my work tends to be very voluptuous and very sumptuous and very layered. So I I like flowers that are very full and have a high petal count. Plus, I'm a sucker for scent. Anytime I can introduce the element of fragrance into an arrangement, I think that just heightens the whole experience. So I'm a fan. I'll always be a fan. Sometimes I use them more than others, but it kind of is like you said. They can be the most pedestrian, or they can be, the most revered of all flowers.
Exactly.
Perfect. Okay, well, something else that both of you do is you like to create these kind of unexpected surprises or aesthetic shocks in your work, whether it's a sudden amazing floral creation on the streets of New York or an unexpected note in a perfume. Is that something that you admire about each other? And talk a little bit about how you approach that.
In fact, when I saw Lewis's work, it was an aesthetic shock, effectively, for me. I'm always searching to create olfactory shocks. But when I saw this floral aesthetic shock, I was so happy. It was like the translation of what I'm trying to create, this burst of flowers, and I could smell them, seeing them on my phone. I was just smelling and having a pure visual, a pure sensorial shock. And this is what really made me so happy to see my quest of creating olfactory aesthetic shock being translated in another kind of aesthetic, visual, floral shock with this, as you were saying just previously, this energy, this power, and this joy, and really creating. You were doing like this when you were speaking of joy, and it is always what I am speaking about without really having the right name, maybe in English, but in French we would say inspiration, we would say relief, like this shock. This is what I really call a shock. And I've been rarely shocked visually with flowers. And this is really what I felt when I saw your flower flashes in the streets of New York. I was, this is, and I really had the feeling to see my perfumes walking in the street and coming on a phone cabin, or being in the street walking. This is what, like if a bottle of pure rose had been broken on the street, and it has flowered the street, and it was really amazing. This is why I was totally, I feel like we are twins with, we have twin brains, I would say.
Yeah. So I've always been a little bit of a fragrance junkie, and so, like, funny little story, when I was probably preteen, like, my favorite place used to be at Macy's at the fragrance counter. And I loved smell. And I used to be able to smell I could identify every fragrance a woman wore at that time. And at that point, it was like, of course, it was like everybody was wearing Poison. So who couldn't smell that and walk in the room a half hour before the person did? But whether it was, Youth Dew or Beautiful or whatever, it's like, I loved fragrance. And I've always loved fragrance. And what I love about Mathilde's fragrances is that I've always really loved rich smelling fragrances and very classical. And it's like but sometimes, like the Shalimars and some of these older, like heavier fragrances, they're so beautiful, but they haven't necessarily moved to a younger generation. And these fragrances have such a richness. They have that kind of authenticity, that like real, like, but then there is that sort of like, it's like, that's the shell, but then there's this burst. And when you were talking first about like the sense of it being alive, that's what it is. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there's something about it. It's like it has the reference points for a very rich and classically structured fragrance, but then it just kind of gives it the middle finger a little bit, and just it catapults it into a much more youthful experience. And I feel like, which is what a lot of fragrances are missing. They just do the youthful, but they don't have the sort of like the anchor. That's so, I don't know what I'm saying, because I'm not a, it's a bumbling way of saying there just seems to be, I appreciate the richness of it, but then it just goes somewhere else. And I think that's the kind of like the joy and the bursting out that it does, and just kind of becomes a whole different experience. And I love rose on men too. I think that that's the sexiest smell. Like, not enough men wear a rose fragrance.
Thank you, Lewis, because it's in France, especially, people could be very classical in their choices, and it is years and years I try to explain that flowers are for men.
Yeah.
And that men can wear flowers, and I often say that it's something incredible to smell a rose on a man, or in the Epio collection you have the lily of the valley, and a man wearing lily of the valley is just wonderful, and it renovates the idea of perfume and flowers and masculinity or femininity, and it just renovates our vision. And this is what I love in my work, and this is also what I love in your work. So renovating how you see flowers, how you see perfumes, how you see being a man or a woman, and what you wear and what you love. Having flowers at your home when you are a man, why not? It's crazy not to consider that.
Yeah.
But it is a time we have lived. We have known this kind of era, but thanks to you, it's thanks to us, I would say it's the end.
I love that. We should all smell like flowers and fill the world with flowers.
Yeah.
What you both do, I think, is just really help people reconnect with their senses and reveal the joy in flowers. So thank you both, and thank you for sharing your inspirations with us today. It's been really wonderful.